Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie, Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Laurie and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this program.
Today, we are going to be talking about the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, those of us with no religious affiliation, with political scientist Ryan Burge.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no religious body seeks to impose its will, directly or indirectly, upon the general populace.
Let's restore respect for America's secular roots. Help the Freedom from Religion Foundation defend the wall of separation between state and church. Join us at ffrf.org. Freedom depends on freethinkers.
I'm Laurie, Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Our guest today, Ryan Burge, is a professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. He specializes in religious demographics. He's the author of the 2021 book, The Nones. And as we noted before, none isn't spelled like the Catholic nun, N-U-N. It's spelled N-O-N-E, referring to those of us with no religious affiliation. Also, and you'll find this surprising, our guest Ryan Burge, who is an expert in the nones, has been a pastor in the American Baptist Church for more than 13 years.
Thank you so much for joining us on Freethought Matters, Professor Burge.
So glad to be with you both.
So, Professor Burge, you're an American Baptist minister. Why have you written a book about the growth of non-religious Americans?
Well, I think I'm always a big believer in you go where people want you to go, right? You don't try to create the market, you just try to tap into what the market already wants. And it all started with a tweet I sent out in 2019 that showed the nones were the same size as Catholics and Evangelicals, tied for the largest religious group in America. And that tweet went viral. And I got calls from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the Daily Mail. I mean, you name it. And they were calling me. I was on C-SPAN talking about this. And I thought, well, this is what people are interested in. This is what the media wants to talk about. This is what people online want to talk about. And no one's really talking about it in a quantitative, rigorous, empirical way. So why don't I kind of step into that void and just describe what the nones look like using all the data tools that I have, the visualizations and the data sets that I'm familiar with. And that's really where it all got started. And from there, it's just turned into one thing to the next thing and the next thing. And I've come to understand that the nones want to understand more about themselves, but there's very few people trying to help them understand more about themselves.
So we've been watching this over the last 30 years. Back in 1990, I think the unaffiliated or the nones were about 7%. And then in 2001 and going on, it's been growing. But today, what does the landscape look like? The American religious landscape look like when it comes to the growth of the nones over time?
Yeah, so you're right. You're right on. In 1972, as far back as we can go, 5% of Americans said they had no religious affiliation. And even into the early 1990s, so 20 years later, it was only about 7%. So very, very small growth over a 20-year period of time. But from there, I call it hockey stick growth, where every year it's 1% or 1.5%. And according to the GSS, it's gone from 7% in 1992 to 23.5% by 2018. We don't have the numbers for 2020 yet, but in other data sets, like Pew, for instance, puts the number about 28%. And I have data sets that show it even higher than that, 30 or 32%, depending on how you ask the question and how the survey's formatted and all those kind of things.
So we typically think of ourselves as being 1 in 4 U.S. adults, and with Generation Z being much more apt to be religiously unaffiliated. So tell us a little bit more about Generation Z. So
Gen Z are just coming of age right now. So we only have survey data on the oldest members of Gen Z because Gen Z, the oldest members are only 24 or 25 today. And we don't survey anyone under the age of 18 for a bunch of privacy reasons and ethical reasons. But what we do know is the oldest members of Generation Z, over 40% of them have no religious affiliation. Which is slightly higher than millennials. Millennials are about 42% or so, but much, much higher than, let's say, Generation X or the baby boomers or the silent generation. We know the baby boomers, it's around 18% are nuns. And again, with Gen Z, it's 44, maybe 45%. So we're talking radical generational change when it comes to religion.
So we're talking about my grandsons, Ethan and Justin. They're the young 20s, and they're just like that. They're just nothing religiously.
Yeah. We're sort of in a post-Christian America in a lot of ways. It used to be Christianity was the default religion for America. And if you look back in the data, I mean, in the 1970s, almost 80% of Americans were Christians. So, I mean, if you were just saying, well, I'm like everybody else, you would say you're a Christian. But now, it's becoming less and less true. And what we're seeing is more nuns are raising nuns, and they're staying nuns as they move into adulthood. For instance, back in the 1970s, 2/3 of people raised without religion picked up a religious affiliation as adults, but now that's reversed. Now 2/3 of people raised without religion don't ever pick up a religion, so they're staying nuns.
So I think it bears repeating that those of us who are not religious, or at least are in that pool of unaffiliated, claiming no religion, is really the largest subset by religious identification in the United States, is it not?
Yeah, so if you add the 3 groups together, atheist, agnostic, nothing particular, you get probably about 1/3 of Americans, depending on what poll you look at. White evangelicals are under 20%. Catholics are slightly above 20%. But yeah, if you look, and actually the largest religious group in America, and I use religious in air quotes here, the largest religious group in America today is a group called Nothing in Particular. And these are people who don't say they're atheists and don't say they're agnostic and don't say they're Christians either, but sort of look at the question and just shrug. I mean, religion's just none of the above for them. So, and that group's growing rapidly, by the way. They were 15% of America in 2008, and they're 20% of America today. I mean, that's that's exponential growth when we talk about religious demography, because oftentimes 1% in 2 or 3 years is a lot, and they're growing 5% in 10 years. So we're talking about significant growth among that group.
So Nothing in Particular, NIP, the NIPs, I guess we could call them.
Yeah, the NIPs.
So,
yeah.
A good title for a book might be The Nun's Story, an N-O-N-E-S story.
Yeah.
You'll have to write it.
Well, because of that old movie, The Nun Story. So, so you're talking about your tweeting, which has gone viral, and we have some tweets. I think we can show you that you have been posting in late August as this show is being recorded. What is this one? A random sample of 1,000 Americans.
I really tweeted this out because people were getting angry with me that I wasn't talking more about non-Christian groups, specifically like Jews, Hindus, Muslims, people like that. And what I wanted to make clear is that in a random sample of 1,000 people, you're going to get a very small number of these smaller religious groups. Even when it comes to atheists, in a random sample of 1,000, you're only going to get about 60 atheists and 60 agnostics, which makes it incredibly difficult to do a statistical analysis when your group is only 60 people. You can't really cut it by gender or race or age or anything else. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. So, the issue here is that people think that researchers are biased towards Christians, and we're just biased toward big samples. And Christians happen to be the biggest sample in America right now, which is declining over time, obviously. But right now, it's easier to do analysis of Christians because there's just more of them.
But still, when you look at that sampling, combining the NIPs, the Nothing in Particular, with the atheists and agnostics, you're at 350 out of 1,000.
That's correct. So the issue, though, is that the nuns are not all created equal. And that's actually a chapter in the book where I kind of break down the atheists, agnostics, and Nothing in Particular as individual groups. So atheists are one of the most educated religious groups in America today. Almost half of them have a 4-year college degree or more. But the Nothing in Particulars are the least educated religious group in America today. Only 20% of them have a 4-year college degree or more. So to put them together in a single category is really sort of what's going to happen is the atheist part is going to be outweighed by the Nothing in Particular part, and the Nothing in Particulars look completely different than the atheist. So it's going to mess up your empirical analysis to kind of lump them all together into one group.
Well, we can certainly say that among the 35,000 members of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, who are mostly boomers, by the way, highly educated. So that certainly bears out what you're saying. Now,
absolutely.
One of your tweets shows that the share of Americans who always believed in God back in 1991 was 89%. And what is it now?
About 74% in 2018 said they always believed in God. If you look at belief questions, they're really interesting because the vast majority of Americans, I mean, over 90% of Americans say they have at least somewhat belief in God. Only about 6% of Americans say they don't believe in God at all. I mean, if you ask them from a belief perspective. And then if you add the agnostic option, it gets around to 10% or so. But belief is actually, what we know in the data, is the last thing to go when it comes to someone becoming a nun. The first thing that goes is religious attendance. And about 40% of Americans say they never or rarely go to church. But we talked about the nuns are about 30%. But then only 10% of Americans say they have no belief. We do see that number rising over time, but it's rising more slowly than the attendance, the never attending is rising, or the nun affiliation is rising.
So we're going to take a break, Ryan, and after that we want to talk about Gen X, how they fit into this whole picture. We're speaking with professor and author Ryan Burge about the growth of the nuns.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name's Jarvis, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. There are many reasons why I'm an atheist, but I'll start with the crudest explanation. I'm sure many of you have seen Clash of the Titans or The Immortals or 300, these blockbuster films about ancient Greek or Roman religion, which we now call mythology. But back then it wasn't mythology. It was very real for them. They genuinely believed that you had to put a coin in a person's mouth before they were buried so that they could pay for the literal ferry to the afterlife. Just as many people today believe that they should eat crackers and wine on a Sunday, or that God wants women to hide their bodies under black burqas. Every religion that has ever existed, and there are many, have all believed that they were right, that their rituals and rules and beliefs were 100% correct, and they all thought they nailed it. But where are they today? If they're not completely forgotten, they're on the silver screen, amusing us with their sword fights, animal sacrifices, and oracles. The religions of today are the entertainment of tomorrow. Everyone, I hope, is an atheist about Zeus and Apollo, Juno and Poseidon. I just added Jesus and Muhammad to that list.
My name is Katie, and I am an out-of-the-closet atheist. I've never really believed in a God. Of course, there are always those moments where you wish an omnipotent being would swoop down and offer divine intervention, but ultimately, you can't reconcile that with reality. I never really liked attending church either. When I was in grade school, I had to go 5 days a week and once on the weekends, and then in high school I had to go, and I went to Catholic school the entire time. One Ash Wednesday after I got my license, I wasn't able to go to church with my family. So I told my mom I would go, but instead I drove to a park, lit the end of a stick on fire, and smudged the ashes on my forehead to prove that I had gone. Ultimately, the church's position on same-sex marriage, women's rights, and their handling of certain scandals were the final nails in the cross, so to speak. As a feminist and a humanitarian, I find it necessary to come out of the closet and declare my atheism.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're talking with political scientist Ryan Burge, who's a researcher who's written a book and is an expert on the growth of the nones, the unaffiliated Americans. And Ryan, we were talking about your tweets, and you announced in one of your tweets that Gen X was really the last religious generation in American history. That's quite a statement. You say millennials are consistently more secular on a number of dimensions. What else can you say about that?
I'm always interested in when things changed. You know, like when things flipped from being more religious to less religious, and what generation got caught up in that. And if you look at Gen X, it's interesting because on almost every dimension, they look a lot more like the boomer parents than they look like millennials. And you can see here, I mean, 80% of Gen X said they've believed now and have always believed in God in 2018. It's only 2/3 of millennials, and Gen Z is about at the same level too. So you really see this huge drop off between Gen X and millennials. You can see it when we look at things like disaffiliation numbers. We got to understand that Gen X grew up at a time that was really pre-internet or early internet, which is a totally different world. You know, in terms of what we had access to information and the world was changing rapidly. Millennials really came of age when the internet really proliferated. So I think it's impossible to pin all this on one factor, but I think we can say that the rise of the internet, the tech sector, has changed every part of American life, including American religion.
So talking about evangelicals now, you posted that we can't just say the word evangelical. We need to kind of have a racial qualifier in front of the evangelical. You write that white evangelicals are overwhelmingly Republican, black evangelicals are overwhelmingly Democratic. So that's quite a racial divide, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think, and I say in a later tweet, I don't want to talk myself out of a job here, but when you look at terms like white evangelical, I think the racial term is doing a lot more work than the religious term. And you can see that across a variety of different religions. And then I did Catholics later, and Catholics looked pretty similar to evangelicals. You know, white Catholics are 60% Republicans, while, you know, Hispanic and Asian Catholics are only 30% Republican. With evangelicals, it's interesting because white evangelicals are 80% Republican, black evangelicals are 90% Democrat, but then Hispanic evangelicals and Asian evangelicals are really evenly divided. And those are the two groups, we know racial groups in America that are growing. It's Hispanics and Asians that are growing the fastest. So that is really what the future of religion looks like. As white evangelicals get older and die off, we're going to see these more politically conflicted groups are going to kind of rise up and become a more important part of the electorate.
The recent study from PRRI, the 2020 Census on Religion, showed that Asian Americans are the least religious group. So that's
right. And I see that in my data too. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Asian Americans, I think largely it's from the culture they came from. If they're first and second generation, especially, you know, if you look at places like China is largely irreligious for, you know, governmental reasons. But even in places like Japan, Thailand, there's very little religion there. And so when they come to America, that's passed down generationally from maybe even 100 years ago or more. Europeans grew up with a lot more religious history, not recently, but 100 or 200 years ago. There was a lot more religious history that came with European immigrants. And I think that's why white Americans, but even Hispanics, are very religious. And that's largely because they came from Central and South America, places where the Catholic Church is very strong.
So there's a statistic that you have in one of your tweets that I really like, comparing atheists versus white evangelicals in 2020. And this tweet shows that atheists are much more politically and socially active. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I always like to challenge the media narrative that surrounds things. And one of the media narratives that sort of exists always is that white evangelicals are super politically engaged and are always going out and doing stuff. You know, we always see pictures of them at, you know, pro-life rallies and things like that. If you look at the data, it's exceedingly clear on this fact. Atheists are much more politically active than any other religious group in America today, even if you control for education. That's what this graph does here. It says that it's not just education that's driving the difference, because even an atheist with a high school degree is much more politically active than a Catholic with a high school degree. So there's something going on in the atheist, you know, subculture that drives them to be more politically engaged. Well, we're not seeing that in Protestant or Catholics. And I think that's something we need to think about going forward is as atheists become a larger and larger part of the American electorate, they're a much more active part of the American electorate too. And they actually might punch above their weight in that they show up. They go to rallies, they go to meetings, they go to protests, they make their voice heard. Well, and that can have a huge impact on electoral politics.
I hope it will.
I voted.
Now, Professor Burge, as we're recording this interview at the end of August, you just had an op-ed published by the New York Times saying that the relentless rise of the nuns is going to spell major trouble for both political parties. Now, I can understand why it would be trouble for the Republicans, and that's sort of easy hanging fruit to figure out, but why for the Democrats?
Yeah, and this is, I hope this is what people bring out of this op-ed, is that the Democratic coalition is sort of a hodgepodge of a bunch of different religious groups that sort of are glued together more often than not by their hatred of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. But it's going to be harder going forward. And I mentioned specifically in the piece this legislation that's winding through called the Equality Act, which would make it illegal for groups to discriminate against people based on their gender or their gender identity or their sexual orientation, which atheists strongly support, obviously. But another big coalition in the Democratic coalition is Black Protestants. So Black Protestants are not in favor of the Equality Act because I said this in the article, 60% of Black Protestants don't think that gay marriage should be allowed in this country, which is no different statistically than white evangelicals. So, how do you square the circle of trying to make your atheist and agnostic faction happy, who are incredibly liberal on social issues, while also not alienating your Black Protestant and Hispanic Catholic base, which has been with you for a long time? And on things like the Equality Act, those two coalitions are at odds with each other.
Well, let's hope that the nuns can educate them about the need for fairness and equality and not homophobia in our society. But you also write that Democrats must not take for granted the increasing number of atheists and agnostics in their coalition, which I sure appreciate. I appreciate that observation because it has seemed to me my whole life that I and other atheists have been taken for granted by liberal social movements.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that the Democrats have benefited so much from the rise of the nuns because they've done very little to court that group.
Right.
Basically, they've courted that group by not being the Republican Party. And I think what we're going to see is as the nuns get, 30%, 40%, there's going to be conservative nuns. That's going to be a rising faction in American politics. So how does the Democratic Party stop taking this group for granted, speak to the needs of this group, bring them, keep them in the coalition? Because I think at some point what you're going to see is a lot of these groups are going to go, I don't believe the Republicans are going to have to pivot away from Christian nationalism a little bit as white evangelicals get smaller. Maybe they can peel off maybe some libertarian nuns, right? Some small government atheists and agnostics. Democrats need to be thinking about these issues because right now they're winning by default. And in the future, that's not going to work any longer.
We did a survey of our membership last year, and it turned into a secular voters survey. And the numbers were absolutely overwhelming, Ryan, in terms of the progressive views of our membership, on gay rights, on abortion, even on things that aren't our issues, like income equality and paying for college education. We were shocked, really, at the overwhelming liberality of our own members. So,
and you can actually see that in the data too. I mean, if you
go ahead.
So we ask people to place themselves in ideological space between 1 and 7, 1 being very liberal and 7 being very conservative, and 4 being moderate. Atheists place themselves further to the left than any religious group in America today, and they actually have put themselves further left every year the last 3 years, while they also put the Democratic Party moving further to the right every year over the last 3 years. So what I think they're saying is we don't think the Democratic Party is as liberal as we want them to be, which is interesting to me because Joe Biden, I think, won the nomination by not being Bernie Sanders, right? Like by being a more moderate centrist type candidate. So I think the Democratic Party is really at a crossroads. If the atheist agnostics who are loud and very vocal about their views pull the Democratic Party to the left, they actually might lose some people in the moderate left side of the spectrum. That's a tough thing to figure out. And the Republicans have their own set of challenges too, but I think this is an interesting kind of conflict that's arising.
You were kind of joking earlier, Ryan, about job security as a pastor with this new demographic. Yeah. Do you happen to know how pastors and religious leaders are dealing with this kind of change, this new demographic that's happening?
Well, a lot of them are not having jobs anymore, to be completely honest. The number of pastors in America has declined significantly. Seminaries are closing left and right because people realize that being a pastor is not a great job when there's not many jobs to be had anymore. I think a lot of them are, and what's really interesting about me is I talk to groups like this, but I also talk to evangelical organizations that are interested in understanding the nuns more and maybe ways to reach out to the nuns more. I mean, I can offer advice in what I see in the data, but I don't think there's any silver bullet to bring any of these people back. I think more often than not, what's happened is that a lot of them left they just don't feel like religion works for them. And you'd have to prove to them that religion works for them in a way that they've never seen before, which for many of them is just impossible. So I think the reality is evangelicals are evangelical. I mean, that's their name. They want to try to win people back to the church, but it's going to get harder and harder every year with atheists and agnostics, especially because they don't change their affiliation over time. If they're going to look at one group to go to, it's the Nothing in Particulars. In the book, I talk about how over a 4-year period of time, 20% of Nothing in Particulars actually come back to a religious tradition. And then another 20% become atheists or agnostics. So they're really the group that has a lot of malleability to them. Atheists and agnostics, 95% of them stay atheists or agnostics over 4 years. So that's really where if there's a mission field, that's where it's at, and Nothing in Particular.
So Professor Burge, at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we really rejoice in the fact that our nation has finally kind of caught up with Europe and is increasingly rejecting religion, or at least finding it has nothing to do with our lives. And I know you're a pastor, you may not agree, but I do know that as an American Baptist, you belong to a denomination that is very much in favor of the separation of church and state. And that's something that we really can agree on, can't we?
You better believe it. I'm a big believer that when you mix government and religion, you get government. And I think that's bad. I believe actually one of the reasons an American religion still is so robust is we've never had a state religion in the United States. I think that's one of the best things we ever did. One of the reasons Europe is so secular is because they have state religion. I think everyone hates, when the government takes over something, everyone hates it, no matter what it is, whether it's a program or a religious group or whatever. I'm a big believer that religion should stay in its lane and politics should stay in its lane. I think that both institutions are better off when they're separate from each other. And that's a Baptist distinctive, by the way. That goes back to the 1600s. That's something we were founded on, is religious freedom. And interestingly enough, we were founded on religious freedom because the founders of the Baptist tradition believed that government would get in your way of your own salvation. It would stop people from being saved. And I still think that's true. I think the more we can get government out of our lives, the better off we are in terms of what we do as a church. And I think the church should stay in its lane and do its social services over here with as little government interference as possible.
Well, amen to that. Well, thank you for all of your work, Professor Burge, and thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.